It's a joke. It's all a joke. We are the punchline. Unknown DRA. Fulton. The room seemed to get both stifling hot and bone-aching cold. The terror next to him primly crossed her legs and smoothed her ankle-length skirt, the light gleaming off of the polished pointed toes of her black shoes. Unvarak swallowed thickly and just stared as she took a long drag off of the Trinidad smoke stick and exhaled another plume of smoke. "D?" he asked dumbly. The terror nodded slowly. "D?" she repeated. "As in?" "The detainee, a.k.a. Dr. Detainee." Unvarak blinked. He'd seen the detainee on images of recovered terror war machines. She had been titled everything from Devil Milky Mommy to Dat Ass Be Shaken, and shown as everything from a massive horned and winged brown-skinned demon to the female terror that sat next to him to a lewdly positioned nude terror female of generous proportions. "I've heard of you," Unvarak said slowly. "Your accent is terrible," she said. She clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth twice and spoke in flawless Grenklecale high speech. "This will be easier than listening to you sound like a cattle-worshipper used car salesman trying to speak drunken potato farmer gobbledygook with a potato famine fleeing peasant accent." Unvarak sat still for a long moment. "I understood none of that." The terror sighed. "That's the problem with being old. Nobody understands your jokes," she said softly. She looked at Unvarak, and for a second he saw her eyes flash red. "And despite my gravity-defying knockers, I'm older than most. Far older." Unvarak just nodded as she leaned back and stared at the screen. "Nice little video, though." Unvarak couldn't find his tongue and just nodded again. "You got my attention messing around with stuff when you powered up the emergency generator," she said softly, still staring at the screen. "I knew, sooner or later, you'd go somewhere I could reach you." Unvarak looked at the screen, which was blank. "Why me?" The terror just snapped her fingers. The lights went out again. She pointed, in the dimness, at the screen, and it started showing images. Imperial Professor Unvarak, 9817-1837A01-1213, was born on Grenklecale Prime in the city of Delta 622 on a rainy day, 167 at Medical Unit 218917, the authoritarian voice stated. It showed pictures of Unvarak as an infant, being cared for by his 2 parental units. He stared as it went through his early life, his education, his early work. At one point the terror next to him was eating puffy white stuff from a bucket and drinking from a large white cup with a red straw as she stared at the screen. It went on to show the classified work he had done, the awards he had been granted, the honorifics and presentations, his speeches and lessons. It even covered his somewhat lackluster love life and how his genetic material was in high demand at the genetic banks, but his actual presence was rarely sought out by anything more than easily impressed female students. Those were attachments he avoided, having seen how quickly a besotted female could turn into a screeching crazy person dancing around a burning car. Then it reached the last 2 terror facilities he investigated. "You got my attention somewhat right here," the detainee said, snapping her fingers to pause the video and audio. He was in the middle of asking questions of the Rigelian composer and conductor. Just knowing what it was, that wasn't enough. Just knowing, vaguely, how it worked, wasn't enough. You wanted to know more of the why it had been made, the detainee said. She suddenly turned and faced him, her expression becoming sneeringly angry and a red flash moving across her eyes. "You weren't some scavenger, out to tear knowledge and technology out of the hands of the dead or from the graveyards of my people," she snarled. Unvarak drew back in fear. She sat back, smoothing her skirt over her knee. She snapped her fingers again, and the video resumed. It showed him examining the second terror super relic. Again, she snapped her fingers during his pleas to the Emperor to hide the object and never refer to it again. "This is what caught my attention the second time," she said. Unvarak just nodded. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask how she knew all of this, but all he could think of was the legends and cryptic references to the detainee that featured prominently in fallen Confederacy and forgotten Council areas. He had read the Book of Ch.18 repeatedly and remembered that their warfather had tempted thrice by her and emerged, not unscathed, but wiser for the experience, and she was sitting right next to him. Somehow, despite the sealing of the suit, he could faintly smell burning sulfur, carbon ash, and burnt organic material. She snapped her fingers, and the video/audio resumed. It got to where Unvarak was stumbling around, then sat down, put his feet up, and feigned sleep. 3 words appeared, then translated into Grenklakale technical script. Possible enlistedman detected. The matron of the damned giggled, an entirely girlish-sounding thing that was at odds with her severe face. The video came to an end with him watching the other video. The detainee stood up, brushing her hands on the top of her skirt. She took out a pack of smoke sticks from her breast pocket, lit one, then put the pack away. "Follow me," she ordered. "If you want to know more than you could possibly find out on your own. Maybe even enough to save people that do not know they teeter on the precipice of extinction." Part of him screaming in alarm, unwilling to follow or trust the terror quasi-deity that he had not even believed in a short time ago, Unvarak accepted her outstretched hand, and she heaved him to his feet, then turned and walked away. He followed her through dark corridors, often passing by door where he could faintly hear growling and see red eyes glaring at him. Virtual intelligences. Woken up by the facility digital sentience when you drove her into a screaming fit, she said as she passed by one room where he could see nearly 24 glaring red eyes and hear growls from multiple creatures. "They'll kill you if they get the chance." "Why?" Unvarak asked. "They're insane," she said, exhaling a trail of smoke. "They are versions of what we call screaming ones, driven mad by the Terran genocide event that wiped out my people." Unvarak said nothing. He had done extensive reading on the Terran genocide event, as it was spoken about in the Book of Ch.18 and the mantras of Ice Cream and the canticles of John Connor. He knew what had wiped out the terrors, but not how it had happened. The passageway suddenly ended in a heavy door, looking more like it belonged to a vault than inside a facility. "Past here, your questions that you did not even know you had will be answered," the detainee stated. Unvarak squinted in suspicion. "The time has come, Unvarak, for science to move from the sterile and controlled laboratory to where it does the most good. The real world," she stated, taking a drag of her smoke stick and exhaling a plume of smoke. "So far, you have shown real promise. Let us see if you can fulfill the potential I see in you." He didn't trust her, but he nodded tightly anyway. As long as he avoided any of her word games, any agreements, any bargains, any gifts, he should be fine. "Put your hand there," she ordered, tapping the square. Unvarak did so. There was a beep and a panel rippled and flowed upward like liquid, exposing a keypad. "Type in your citizen identification number. That's what I keyed as your password," she stated. He did so, and the pad beeped. His mouth was dry, and taking a pull off of the water tube did nothing. The door made a loud cracking sound and slowly retracted into the wall, revealing another corridor. The detainee moved down it, stopping at another door. He repeated her instructions, and the heavy door withdrew into the wall. Beyond it was a large room full of bulky computers with old radiation/film cathode ray monitors displaying streams of data. The detainee went up to one and stared at the data. Unvarak stared at what was at the far end of the room, a large hexagonal chamber, built in the middle, made out of armor glass that was bright green with red swirls and white starbursts. There were convex mirrors on either side that showed behind the chamber. The chamber had a single door that was closed, with a handle that obviously opened it. "What is this?" Unvarak asked. "My magnum opus," the detainee said, tapping the keyboard to bring up more screens of streaming data. "What are you doing?" Unvarak asked, staring at the different monitors. The detainee looked up. "I can read the data in real time directly," was all she said. She motioned at the door. "Go ahead, open it up. Just twist the handle so it points down and the door will open." "Why would I do that?" Unvarak asked. "Curiosity's sake," the detainee said. "Aren't you curious as to the secrets my people held tightly to?" Nodding, Unvarak nervously moved up. Part of him wanted to run, but already he'd learned a lot. The detainee followed, making the tooth-baring grimace of terror-pleasure. He opened the door and stared inside. There were hexagonal plates on the floor, concentric circles in the middle. The light was dim, pleasant-looking. On the floor was a piece of plastic, face down. "What is it?" Unvarak asked. The detainee made a motion. "It's explained on the card," was all she said. Unvarak looked at her for a long moment. She stood with one hand on the door, staring down at him, a slight twist of the mouth corners displaying amusement. He looked back into the room, but was unable to see any kind of trick or trap. He clonked in, his boots thudding on the armor-glass floor. He bent down and picked up the card, looking at it. "Turn it over," the detainee said. He did so. "Are you a virgin?" was written on it. He looked over at her and saw her mouth was in a wide, predatory grimace full of sharp teeth. Her shadow behind her was huge, winged, with horns on her head and claws for hands. She was completely nude, her sexual and nursing organs visible, her hair hanging down wild and tangled. "Because you're fucked now," she yelled, howling with laughter. She slammed the door. There was a humming noise as Unvarak moved for the door. Mist started up at his feet as he pounded on the door, grabbing at the handle and finding it locked. Darkness surged up and took him. Her laughter followed him. The robots all waited until the timers ran out. They had not received a proof-of-life signal from Unvarak's suit for a designated period of time. They all moved up to the battery-powered unit, which wound their springs, then moved away. It took some time, but they reached the airlock. They flashed lights and waited patiently for the 6 hours it took for them to be recovered. They were transferred back to the scientific vessel, and their memory units were examined. The data was sanitized, using protocols designed by Unvarak himself, and then the data was carefully gone over. When the recordings, audio and visual, both on separate robots, of the movie were displayed, there was near universal dismay at the power and sheer danger of the object. "If there is this one, there are many more," was the consensus. The robots all ended their recordings at the same place. Unvarak sat down, the movie played, and when the lights came up a nude female terror was present, shown in data, or on visual media, or just her voice. "Shoo, go home, little ones," she said, waving at them. When one technician identified the terror as the figure of myth and legend, the detainee, the flotilla commander, made his decision. They retreated back to the Empire for further orders, and the orb sat alone, floating in space. Unvarak came to hearing voices, panting and trying to breathe inside his suit. It was hot and dry, and he couldn't seem to get enough air. "Is he alive?" someone asked. "I think so," someone else said. "I hope his brain isn't scrambled like the last two," someone else said. "Well, he's not chunks of meat still trying to scream. That's an improvement," yet another said. "Get his helmet off. Let him get some air," one said. He could feel his latches being undone even as he tried to open his eyes. He had a pounding headache, his guts hurt, and he felt like he had been dragged down a bumpy road. He realized he couldn't get any air, that the fans were silent, right as the helmet was pulled off. The air was canned, tasting stale and old, like it was full of dust, but he inhaled deeply anyway, opening his eyes. Fulton looked down at him, one ear missing, a scar down the side of the little rodent's face. You will feel better. The jump shock will pass, the DRA, Fulton said. Unvarak groaned, closing his eyes. I feel terrible. It will pass, another being said. What happened? Unvarak asked. The detainee sent you here, someone said. Where is here? Unvarak asked. He tried opening his eyes, but the light made him wince. We don't know exactly, someone said. He opened his eyes again, seeing that there were dim lights in the ceiling. It took a minute to come in focus. He realized that the lights had been so bright because his optic nerves had been stunned and his irises had been widely dilated. What do you know? Unvarak asked. He groaned and slowly sat up, looking around. A smattering of different species all sat in chairs next to computers. The hexagonal chamber was cream-colored with smears of amethyst on it. Just the area of space, as it's known to the fallen Confederacy, another DRA, Fulton said. It was female, large, wearing a military uniform. Unvarak knew that meant she was part of the DRA, Fulton military, part of the Way of the Means. Which is? Unvarak asked, silently cursing how getting information was difficult for no reason. There was an uncomfortable silence as Unvarak accepted a Strevikal's hand and a DRA. Fulton's hand, and the two heaved him to his feet. Well? Unvarak asked. At the far end of the room, the heavy door had scrapes on it, like someone had tried to pry it open. The datapad next to the door was still covered with a clear macroplast shield, and the palm square was glowing softly. The beings all looked at one another. The DRA. Fulton soldier looked at Unvarak. The clown face nebula. Unvarak could hear the detainee's howling laughter in his memories.